Hi everyone, welcome to the Leucadendron tutorial. This is the photo I took and used as reference for the painting. This is a Leucadendron and they are native to South Africa. We grow them here in Australia and they're often used in floristry. I'm painting on a piece of Arches cold press paper. This is 640 GSM or 300 pound in weight. Most artists don't stretch this thickness of paper, but I do because it has a tendency to bow when you work wet like I do, and I prefer to paint on paper that's flat. I've got some washi tape around the edges, so when I cut it off the board, I'll have a white border around the edge. Over the top of the washi tape, I have some masking tape. I put that on there to hold the washi tape in place. Because the washi tape is low tack, it lifts off the paper when I use the hairdryer on it, so the masking tape keeps it in place. The size of my paper is 28 centimetres by 38 centimetres. It was a full sheet of paper that I cut into quarters. When I cut it from my board after I've finished the painting, it will be 25 centimetres by 35 centimetres. I've left a lost edge on this petal just here where there's no pencil line, another one here and here. There's a lost edge, and here on one of the leaves, also there, another one here, just there, and right down the bottom, I've got one just there. What I'll do down the bottom of the painting where I've got my lost edges, I'll be painting a green wash onto the background, and that will help me to create the lost edges there. On the flower, I will put a yellow wash on the background, and that will allow me to leave the lost edges up the top there. I've got some Daniel Smith masking fluid on an old liner brush here. I've decided to mask in all those little yellow shapes on the centre cone. Thought it would be easier to do that than to try and paint around them. And when you use masking fluid for the first time on your paper, always check first before you put it on your painting. Put it somewhere on the edge of the painting where it's not going to matter. Make sure that you can remove it okay. Make sure it doesn't tear the paper and make sure it doesn't discolour the paper. Okay, all those little yellow shapes have now got masking fluid on them and I need to let that dry. On my palette, I've got some permanent rose, some Windsor lemon, and some French ultramarine. I need sort of a dirty mustard colour yellow for the petals. So the main colour is going to be Windsor lemon. That's what I'll use the most of here. Into that, I'll mix a tiny bit of the French ultramarine. Turns it a sort of a green colour, and then a really small amount of permanent rose. Add it sparingly when you do that. So the main colour is the Windsor lemon. I'm going to put a bit more in there. You can see only a tiny bit of red has really changed the colour of that. I'll put a tiny bit more of the French ultramarine in there. And then I start to mix some water with it. And that should give me a nice mustard colour that I think resembles the colour of the petals. On another palette, I need some green for the leaves. I use Windsor lemon and French ultramarine. Now I'll grab some French ultramarine from the other plate here. And to that, I mix some water. Okay, both of these colours I'll be using on the background when I paint that in. I might put a tiny bit more of the blue in there. before we start, make sure your pencil lines aren't too dark. Rub over them with an eraser if they are. This little brush here is a 2-inch Da Vinci Casaneo flat brush, and I'm going to use this to paint some water all over the paper. I've got some clean water. This I paint from top to bottom over the flower, all over the paper. I make sure it's well covered and nice and wet. I've got some ordinary masking tape over the top of the washi tape to keep it in place. Washi tape is low tack, and when I wet it, it tends to lift. Also, when I use the hairdryer on the paper, it'll lift off. Okay, that's covered completely with water now. I've got my number 8 brush and I pick up the yellow mixture with it. And I start to paint in the petals on the yellow flower. Also paint in the background here. I'm painting flat on the table at the moment, but I am going to lift the board up. I want the paint to flow up to the top of the painting, so I'll lift it up. Just here I've got some paper towel and I'm taking a bit of paint off the side of that petal there. Okay, the board is flat on the table again now, and I've got some of the green mixture. I start to paint that onto the wet paper, where the leaves are. Now I lift the board off the table again to make the paint flow. Tilting it to the right hand side now, and up to the top as well. I'm painting very loosely. I'm not holding the brush too tight, and I'm holding it way back from the ferrule as well. So tilt your board around to make the paint flow towards the edges of the paper. You may find that your colours separate a little, but don't be concerned about that. That's part of the beauty of painting with watercolour. So now I accept what it gives me. I take a paper towel, I take off the excess from around the edges. I don't want that flowing back onto the paper as it dries, creating watercolour blooms where I don't want them. I lay it flat again, I get some paper towel and I sop up some of the paint that's gone onto those petals there. Doesn't matter if there's a little bit, but I didn't want too much. Take a bit off that one as well. And here's a photo of my painting at this stage. This one is Progress Photo 1 that you can download. Everything's dry. Now I'm going to paint this petal at the top. So I'm wetting it with my number 8 round brush, and I'll work on the wet paper. When I wet it, I wet within the pencil lines. I'm not wetting the background as well. I thought I'd wet the petal next to this one as well, down low where the 2 petals touch, this one here, so that I can get a lost edge where they meet at the bottom. Okay, that's ready for some paint now. This is what's left over from the background. I'll put a bit more of the French ultramarine in there. I'll paint that down the bottom here where the pencil line is to create an edge. Take it over to that cone in the middle, and then you can see it bleeding onto that petal beside this one as well. The paint has drifted to the edge of the waterline in that second petal, and I don't want a hard edge along there, so I'll need to fix that in a second. So along here, I don't want a hard edge, so I need to use my damp brush to soften away the paint line. Up the top here, a little bit more of that colour. And I'm trying to keep the paint away from those two lost edges that I've got. Now I've got nothing on my brush, it's just slightly damp with water, and I use it to feather the paint so that you can't see any edges. Now to paint in that top edge, I'll get a bit of permanent rose. I'll use my little zero brush to pick the paint up. And right up the top here, while the paint's still wet, I paint on the permanent rose. I let the paint bleed over the paper there, and then I take the paint out of my brush and I push the paint down a bit further. You can see it's streaky like that on the reference photo. Now I'll paint in this petal tucked in the back here. I use my number 5 brush to paint some water onto it. And then I paint that same colour onto this one. This is the mixture of paint that I mixed up at the start, but I've put a bit more French ultramarine into it. Then I get my little zero brush and some of the permanent rose, and I paint that on the top here. Now I'll work on this petal just here at the back. Some water on it again. I won't be painting the little curled over part yet, just the inside section. And then I paint that mixture on there. This petal also has a lost edge, so I'll be keeping the paint away from that area. Here I'm painting in the top edge, the top point. I'm going to put a little bit of the permanent rose on that one. Just a little bit down in there next to the cone while it's wet. Over to this one now on the outer right hand edge. Some water. Bit more blue into my mixture. Looked a bit greener to me there on the reference photo. This one's got a lost outer edge as well, so I keep the paint away from there. And I allow the colour of the background to become the colour of the petal. I might get a bit of French ultramarine on my brush here. And I'll dab that in there. I might put a bit of that on the side here and spread it out. And up the top here, I can see a tiny little bit of pink. So I've got a small amount of permanent rose on the little zero brush. I'm going to dry that off with the hairdryer now. That's completely dry now. I've got my eraser here and I'm removing any pencil lines that aren't covered with paint. It's cleaning it up a bit for myself. Now I'm painting this little section just here with some water. I paint some of that background mixture in there as well. Now I want some green. I'm going to paint in the center cone. So this is the background mixture that I used on the leaf area. It's a mixture of French ultramarine and Windsor lemon. I'm going to wash that over the entire shape. All the petals are dry and the masking fluid is still in place. I'll leave that to dry and I'll paint this curved over part here. This is the yellow mixture again. Paint that down the bottom there where I see that shadow. And a little bit at the top as well. I'm not liking the way the paint has dried on the edge of this petal just here. So I'm going to put a bit more colour there to try and fix it up. Got my little zero brush and some of the yellow mixture. Bit more pigment now. And then I thought this one here could have a bit more colour on it as well. So I wet that with water. And I put some of that mixture there as well. So it's the background colour that I used on the petals, but I've got a bit more of the French ultramarine in it to green it slightly. And over here I'm putting a little bit more of that colour as well. I'm painting on dry paper here. If I need to soften an edge, I'll do that quickly before it dries. Use my other brush slightly damp and softens away that top edge a bit. Okay, let's have a look at this petal at the front here. There's a fair bit of colour on this one. I'm going to wet the entire petal from edge to edge. I'll work on the wet paper again and that will keep the paint edges soft. I don't want any hard edges on this petal anyway. I use the yellow mixture again with a bit more blue in it. And I paint that on. Now this has got sort of a darker cast shadow on it, so I'm trying to paint that on now. It's lighter on the left-hand side. It's also a bit lighter on the right-hand side. There's a little cast shadow at the bottom, but I'll paint that on later on dry paper. So I keep an eye on the reference photo as I paint, and I keep this layer of paint off those lighter areas. My zero brush and some permanent rose now. Right up the top of this one, I paint the permanent rose. It's coming down the sides a little way as well here. It's getting the shape of it right. And then I can push the paint down a bit further. So I've taken the paint out of my brush here and I use the paint that I've already got on the paper. I spread it out over the wet paper. Take it down the side a little way and then streak it over the front. While that's wet, I'll quickly grab a little bit of French ultramarine and I'll paint that on the tip here where it's wet. That'll give me a sort of violet colour there. Just altering the shape of mine. And a touch more of the French ultramarine. I allow them to merge together on the wet paper. Okay, I'll take a photo of my painting before I go any further. This is progress photo 2 that I've included for you to download. It's dry and I've got my small eradicator brush. There's a tiny little highlight here on this petal. If you look at the reference photo, you'll see it. So I thought I'd take a touch of paint off there. The brush is wet, the paper is dry. I can see another little highlighted section just here on this back petal. So again, I rub with the wet brush on the dry paper. I can also see a little bit of light there as well. Now I'm removing the masking fluid off the center of the flower. I'm using a rubber cement pickup tool here, but you can also use an eraser. I'm getting a bit of Windsor lemon on my zero brush. And I start to paint in those little yellow sections on the center. I do this on dry paper. It's quite straightforward. Okay, now that they're all painted in, I'm going to dry them off with the hairdryer so I can continue on with this center section. I need some green now, so I'll mix some French ultramarine into Windsor lemon. The painting is dry now. I've got my number 5 brush and some of that green mixture, and I'm going to wash it onto the right-hand side of this center section. It's in shadow there on the reference photo, so I need to darken it slightly. I end up coming back later on and I darken it even further. I'm also painting this colour over the top of those little yellow sections because they're in the shadow as well. I'll dry that off now with the hairdryer so I can continue on. I need some more green, but I need it to be darker, so I'll use some more pigment this time. French ultramarine and Windsor lemon again. My brush is only slightly damp when I pick the pigment up. I don't want to dilute it too much. And I pick it up with my little zero brush. Okay, now I need to start defining some of these darker areas. So here I'm working on dry paper. And what I'm doing is I'm painting around those little arched sections. If I need to soften an edge, I grab my other brush that's slightly damp with water, and then I soften the edge with that. So I'm painting the areas around those little arch shapes. Take my other brush again and I soften away that edge. I'm starting to paint on a little bit of colour onto the arched sections themselves. Take your time with this. It's a little time consuming, requires some patience. I find it easier to use the 2 brushes than to try and do it with 1. And when I put the paint on the arch section itself, it's not quite as dark, so I've watered it down a little. Now I'm painting some green shadows onto the right-hand side of the little yellow shapes. Helps to make them look less flat. This is on the yellow shapes that are in the sun, not the shapes that are in the shade. And that helps to separate one from another there as well. I dried that off with the hairdryer. Now I'm going to increase the shadow on the right-hand side. Just make sure everything is completely dry. For this, I'll use some French ultramarine just on its own. And I paint that onto the right-hand side where the shadow is. I painted the shadow before, but it just wasn't dark enough. I think that looks better now. Here I'm fixing up the edge of the petal below just to make sure it's right. Okay, now I want to paint a shadow on 2 petals at the front, so I'll go back to my original mixture. It doesn't matter if it's not quite the same as what I started with, just close enough will do. Into that I mix a little bit of French ultramarine, a bit more lemon, and a tiny bit of permanent rose. That's too much. I'll take it off my brush. And then a little bit more yellow. And I take a tiny bit of the permanent rose then, so be careful with the permanent rose. I'll wet that petal at the front with some water. I need to deepen the colour on this as well, it's not dark enough. I pick up the colour I mixed and I paint that onto the wet paper here. You can see that shadow again. Now I've painted this before, but I didn't have the colour dark enough or deep enough, so I'm doing it again a second time. Hopefully that will be better now. A little bit of French ultramarine into that to deepen the colour slightly. And I paint that on down the bottom here where I see that little cast shadow. It actually runs up that other petal as well. I'll paint it on this one first and then I'll extend it onto that other one. I'll soften that edge a bit there and then I'll join up with it later. I mentioned earlier that I'll be painting this shadow here on dry paper. I do end up coming back later on and paint the shadow again on the dry paper this time, that little cast shadow at the bottom. And now I need to get some colour on this one here, so I'm painting some water onto it. I can't take the water all the way over to the right-hand side because this other petal here is still wet. I don't want to disturb it. I pick up the paint where I've put that French ultramarine and then I paint that down the edge there where I can see the shadow. it extends up here. And over to here. Okay, so as I said, later on I come back and I paint over that on dry paper. I'm going to dry that petal off now so that I can paint the shadow in on the right-hand side of it. The paper is dry now. I've got my eraser. I'm reducing the darkness of the pencil lines. Now I'm painting some water onto this side so that I can paint in that shadow there. The shadow has a soft edge down the left-hand side of it, so that's why I'm wetting the paper first. I think I'll put a tiny bit more blue in that, French ultramarine. And I'll run it down this edge where it touches the other petal. But I won't put any more colour on the middle part of this petal, I'll leave it as it is. Okay, onto this petal now. It's got a little shadow running down the front edge of it that I need to paint on. Some water. And then I use that same mixture down the front edge. And the other paint to bleed over the paper. And I take the paint out of my brush. I smooth the paint out, spread it where I want it, make it sit better. Now a little bit more paint, I've just picked up a bit more. And here I've got my zero brush and some permanent rose. The paper's wet up here as well. And again, I get the paint out of my brush and I spread that paint out a bit more. When I take the paint out of my brush, I quickly dip it in my water container and then very quickly dab it on my towel to take the excess moisture out of it. And like that petal at the front, I've just picked up a bit of French ultramarine. I paint that on there while the permanent rose is still wet. The two colours blend on the wet paper and make a violet. While I wait for that to dry, I've got a Prismacolor watercolour pencil. The colour is Sunburst Yellow. I think the colour of the little yellow segments are a bit pale, so I'm drawing over the top with this pencil. So it doesn't have to be this particular yellow, any yellow pencil will work okay. I'm not going to activate the pencil, I'll just leave it dry. Now I want some pale yellow, so I'm watering this mixture down with a lot of water. I want it quite pale for the edge of this petal here, just on dry paper. Then I take it over the rest of it as well, and I will deepen the colour inside once it's dry. Okay, I'll take a photo of my painting before I go any further with it. Here it is here. This is Progress Photo 3 that you can download. Just getting a bit of Windsor lemon here. Nothing mixed with it other than a little bit of water. I've dried the paper, so now I can paint in the inside part of this petal. And then here with my little zero brush, I've got some permanent rose and I paint that onto the wet Windsor lemon. I'll let it bleed. make sure the shape of the petal is the way I want it. And I take the paint out of my brush again and I spread that paint down. Right at the top of that petal, the colour is a bit darker, so I'll use some more permanent rose, but thicker this time. And then it will sit where I put it and it will be much darker. It's actually pure pigment. Just taking it down the edge there. This little one here at the front, I'm thinking I'm going to paint a bit of Windsor lemon on this one as well to give it a golden glow. I'm painting a bit of water on it first. This is straight Windsor lemon, there's no other colours mixed with it. Okay, it's not very bright, it's fairly pale. I need a darker colour. I might put a bit of blue in that, but then I end up putting too much blue. So I wash my brush out and I get a bit more of the Windsor lemon. It's a bit heavy-handed. There's also a little bit of permanent rose there. And I paint that here where I see that little shadow. It's a bit darker there on the front of it. The Windsor lemon underneath is still wet. And I'll paint some on this side as well. And up the top, some permanent rose. I can see that the pink runs down the edges on this one as well. And a little bit further down here. And now I've got permanent rose again, but it's thicker pigment. And a little bit of the French ultramarine on the top of that permanent rose. Now a little bit of the green, that was the Windsor lemon French ultramarine mixture. The paper's still wet here. It's not as wet as it was though. I dried everything off. I had a look and I think this area down in here could be slightly darker. Getting a bit of Windsor lemon. I'll paint that on there to brighten it up a touch. I also thought the outside edge of this one here could have a bit of colour down lower. This is the yellow mixture. It's got the 3 colours in it. I also put a bit of the mixture colour here as well. I felt this wasn't dark enough. This is on wet paper here, but you could paint it on dry paper and then just quickly soften the edge. Which I'll do now. A touch of water just here. And the yellow mixture here too. Deepening that colour slightly. And some water here on this one. I want to deepen the colours slightly down in here. And here I've got the leaf mixture that I used on the background behind the leaves. That's the French ultramarine and Windsor lemon mixed together. Here I'm softening that edge away. And I'll take a photo of my painting again now for you. Here is progress photo 4 that you can download. I want to leave the flower for now and start painting in the leaves. So I'm mixing some Windsor lemon with some French ultramarine. I want a fairly dark mixture. Using my number 5 brush, I paint in that leaf that's tucked in behind here on dry paper. Now I do come back later and darken this area so it's got more than one layer of paint on it before I'm finished. And then this other side as well. With the leaves, as I work my way down to the bottom of the painting, I'll be fading the colour away. Just in here I can see the leaf as well. And then I paint in this leaf on this side the same way on the dry paper. For the bottom section of this leaf, I'm going to paint some water onto the paper because I want to fade the colour away and I want to add a lighter green at the bottom. So for that, I mix a bit of French ultramarine into Windsor lemon, but it's got more Windsor lemon. I don't want a really dark green like I used before. And I'll paint that down here. It looks a bit lighter there on the reference photo. Just softening that edge a bit there. And now the darker green here. I've got a bit of water in my brush so that the colour's not as dark. And then I picked up a little bit more pigment and I dabbed it up here. This one here I'll paint in now. This one has a lost edge on the right hand side of it. So I've wet all of it with water. Now I've got the green mixture. I'm going to keep the paint away from that edge on the right. And I'll allow the background colour to show there on the leaf. I'll take my clean damp brush to run over that area just to soften the paint line a bit more. And then I use a little bit of the permanent rose and I run it down that left hand edge. That's the zero brush. And I will take a photo of my painting before I progress any further. This one is progress photo 5 that you can download. Now this leaf on the right hand side, this one also has a lost edge. So I need to keep the paint away from that right edge there. So I've just wet it with water and I've kept the water within the edges of the leaf. I'll start with the lighter green mix. I'll paint that down the bottom here. Now I want some darker green. I'll mix myself up a new batch. Always using Winsor Lemon and French Ultramarine. While I mixed that paint, my paper started to dry, so I'm just putting a bit more water there now. And then I use that darker green mixture up the top. I avoid the right edge, but I run it down the front edge. And then some permanent rose on my zero brush. I run that down the edge. And because I'm in the shadow here, I'll put a bit of French Ultramarine over the top of the permanent rose there. Still slightly damp at the bottom here, and I've just picked up a bit more of the darker green on my zero brush. I'm painting that on, but I've left a little lighter edge at the front to give the leaf an edge. It's also got that golden glow underneath now. And now this leaf on the other side, I do the same thing with this one pretty much. I'm going to wet it with water. This one has a lost edge on the left-hand side. Just going to use my little zero brush for this one. Paint down the edge. Now there's my lost edge, so I keep the paint over near the pencil line. I kept the paint colour on this one fairly pale. Here I've got permanent rose that I run down the edge. And now I'll soften that edge up the top there with my damp brush. And I've managed to keep my lost edge on the outside of it. I dried the side of the leaf off with the hairdryer, and now I'll paint in the inside part of it. For that, I'll use the yellowy green, so the green with more of the Winsor Lemon in it. And on the dry paper, I paint that in there. I'll move on down to this one. This leaf doesn't have a lot of colour on it, and it's also got a lost edge. So I'm only going to put a tiny bit of colour on those areas where the pencil lines are. Just a little bit of colour. Down the bottom here where the pencil lines are. It's just a hint of colour. And a little bit up here. Take it down that right hand side as well. And permanent rose, while that paint's still wet, I run it down that right hand edge. I'll take the paint out of my brush and I pull it further down. This leaf in behind here, I'll paint on dry paper with that pale green. It's further away, so it doesn't need a lot of colour on it. Now I'm right down the bottom of the painting, this leaf down here. I've wet it with water and I'll put a blush of colour on it, not too much. As I said earlier, as I move my way down the stem, I'm fading the colour away because I don't want to draw attention down here. So I need soft, pale colours down here. And then I use permanent rose around the edge, but you can see the permanent rose is quite pale as well. Just going to spread that out now. And that will dry lighter than it looks there. Make sure your pencil lines aren't too dark down here particularly. And that brings me to Progress Photo 6 that I've included for you to download. Now to this leaf right at the top. I'll wet it with water. I'm going to keep the left side light and the right side will have the shadow on it. Okay, I use my green mixture here. This is my number 5 brush that I'm using. I paint that onto the wet paper. This is the lighter colour. I will go darker on the right hand side. Now I mix more French ultramarine into my green mixture because I need a deeper, darker colour. And I paint that on this side. This will give me a beautiful shadow here. The shadow also goes over onto this side as well. And I painted a few streaks too. And then some permanent rose with my little zero brush before that paint dries. I just quickly dabbed my brush then to get rid of the excess permanent rose on there. And on the shadow side, I drop a bit of French ultramarine on top of that permanent rose. Now, this leaf here is quite dark on the reference photo. It's on the shadow side. I'm not going to make it that dark though, because as I said, I don't want to really draw the eye down here if I can help it. So I will make some adjustments. I'm going to get a little bit more Windsor lemon. Paint that onto the wet paper. I'll keep it a bit lighter at the bottom, I think, this one. So I've started at the top with the colour. I haven't included a lost edge on this one. A bit more of the yellowy green. I paint that there. It looks a bit more yellow there on the reference photo to me. I'll take the paint out of my brush now. There's nothing on it, it's just slightly damp. And I feather that paint down to the bottom. And then a little bit of permanent rose. Run it down the edge. I fade it off as it moves its way down. And to tone it down a touch, a little bit of French ultramarine on top of that permanent rose. Now I want some of the lighter yellowy green, and I'll paint this one in here. Then I thought that looked a bit yellow, so I used the other green over here. This one I want to be fairly pale as well. So I'll take the paint out of my brush now, and I'll use the paint that's on the paper, and I'll move it down with the damp brush. Then with my zero brush, some permanent rose, and I run that down the front edge. Taking the paint out of my brush now, and then I spread it down. Okay, now I'll dry both of those leaves off. I dried both of them, and now I want a bit more colour at the top of this one. So I've wet that with water. Use my green mixture, and I paint that up the top. The leaf above is fairly dark on the shaded side, and I felt I went just a little bit too light too quickly on this one. So hopefully that will make a difference. Now down to this one below. This one also has a lost edge. I'll keep it fairly pale, and I'll also keep the paint away from that lost edge. The leaf above I won't disturb because I didn't take the water all the way down to the bottom edge. If you did wet the entire leaf above, dry it off before you try to paint this one. Okay, you can see I've avoided that lost edge there. I'll take the paint out of my brush now and just smooth it away. Now I'll put a bit of that colour in here. I can see a leaf tucked in behind. The paper's dry here. And that continues down under there. Now for the stem, I use the green that's got more of the Windsor lemon mixed into it. And I start to paint that in on dry paper. Now before that dries, I get some of the green with more of the blue in it. And I paint that down the right hand side. I can see that's not going to be dark enough, so I'll get a bit more of the French ultramarine. And I paint that on there. So it's lighter on the left hand side and then the shadow on the right. I do the same sort of thing down here, but I won't go quite as dark as what I did on the section of the stem above. So the more yellowy green first, and then green with more of the French ultramarine in it. This is the final progress photo. This one is progress photo 7. I'm at that stage of the painting now where I stand back and look at it and see if there are any areas that I think I can improve. And one thing that I think I can do is increase the contrast in a few places. So I've just wet this leaf here with some water. Now I'll add a bit more of the French ultramarine to my green mixture. And I paint that onto the shadow side. Then I felt this area down in here could be darker at the base. So I put a bit of that colour there. That's on dry paper. And now I'll soften that edge at the top. And then I felt I needed to deepen the colour of these leaves here at the back. So I put some of that colour in there too. Even though these leaves are further away, I felt that it would improve the painting if I added a bit more contrast around the flower. So normally I would keep those leaves further back, a bit paler, but I felt here it would be better if I made them darker so that the flower would stand out more. I also ran a bit of permanent rose down the edge as well. Because I deepened the colour on the top section, I felt I needed a bit more colour here as well. So here I'm wetting it with water so that I can allow the paint to bleed and give me a soft edge. I don't want to take the colour all the way down the leaf. I didn't put enough water on there, so it's not bleeding the way I wanted it to. So then I take the paint out of my brush and soften away that edge. And this is permanent rose again. And then a bit more colour on this leaf here on dry paper. I still wasn't happy with this darker area on this petal at the front. I felt I needed to put a bit more paint on it. So here I'm wetting it with some water. I need that shadow mixture, which was a mixture of the three colours, but more of the Winsor lemon. So Winsor lemon, touch of the French ultramarine, and a little bit of the permanent rose. And I paint that onto the wet paper with my number 5 brush. Just roughly where that shadow sits. Then I take the paint out of my brush and I soften edges that I need to. Then I layered a bit more paint over this little shadow again, the cast shadow at the bottom. This petal here in the middle is dry, so I'll soften that edge there. I felt that this inside part of this leaf was a bit too yellow, so I wet it with water. Then I got my little zero brush and some of the green that's got more of the French ultramarine in it, and I ran it along the front edge. So it's a mixture of French ultramarine and Winsor lemon, but more of the French ultramarine. I'm not making any major changes, I'm just trying to adjust things and improve the painting. I wet the stem here and then I added a bit more of the darker green here, so the green with more blue in it. This shadow up here again I think could be slightly darker, so I wet it with water. I quickly deepened the colour slightly. It's a mix of the three colours again. That needs a bit more lemon in it, I think. And then I use my little zero brush here to get in and around all those little yellow stamen things. Because I'm painting this on, that will make them stand out a bit more now. And then I switched to my number 5 brush to take the paint up a bit further on the petal. I took the paint out of my brush then, and then feathered that paint up. I also wet this petal here with some clean water, and I painted a bit of that colour there on the right-hand side of it. And here's where I decided that that cast shadow at the bottom of this one could have a hard edge on it. So I painted some of that colour on the dry paper this time. So little adjustments, I think they make a difference to the final painting. I even put a bit of that colour down in there on the wet paper as well. And then I softened away the edge. I felt this one could do with a little shadow down lower, so I've just wet it with water. And then I paint some of that shadow mixture down in there. At this stage of the painting, I'm not really looking at the reference photo anymore. All I'm doing is looking at my painting, and I'm looking for those areas that I think need a bit more work or a bit more colour, a bit more contrast. Sometimes it's not very obvious to me and I have to wait a few days and come back to the painting. Sometimes I'll take a photo of my painting and then I'll put it onto my computer and then I can see it with fresh eyes that way. Sometimes the changes I need to make are glaringly obvious when I look at it on the computer. With that one, I didn't take the water all the way over to that right edge, and then I've just put some of that colour there and it's given me a little light edge on that side. Here in the centre part, I've got a bit of French ultramarine on my brush, my little zero brush, and I'm deepening some of those shadows on dry paper. So it's just French ultramarine with no other colours mixed with it. Just painting in that area where one arch touches the other. Just defining them a bit more. And then I decided to get a bit of the French ultramarine and glaze it over the top of these darker areas here on this leaf. So it's French ultramarine on dry paper. I think I was thinking that the blue might make the yellow of the petals stand out a bit more. I also glazed it over the bottom section as well. Not as dark though down here. And then of course I had to paint it on this one too. Really carefully, trying not to get it onto the petals and the surrounding leaves. Also under here as well. I thought I'd paint a bit of water there first. That's enough. I'll take the paint out of my brush and I'll feather that down. I decided to put a little bit more colour on this petal here right at the top of it. So that's a bit of water, and I'll use the shadow mixture, which is the 3 colours mixed together with more of the Winsor lemon in it. I'll get my other brush now and I'll soften away that edge a bit more. Just fixing the shape of it there. With this leaf here, I wanted a little edge on the left-hand side. So when I wet it with water, I didn't take the water all the way over at the bottom. This is the leaf underneath that one with the shadow on it on the right-hand side. I got a bit of the green mixture, not the really dark green mixture. I ran it down there and then I created that little edge. And then I got my number 5 brush and put a bit more pigment there. And then I was happy with it. I decided to call it finished. I took the washi tape off and then I cut it off the board. This was one of those paintings that I really enjoyed. It seemed to flow off the brush easily for me. So thanks everybody. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial.